Good. All right. Well, let's get started. And thanks for joining us.
Okay. Basically, the questions that I've gotten the most in the last 18 hours since we put this thing on is about jobs. People are worried about job creation in Connecticut. How can we increase employment opportunities without endangering the little guy, protecting the people? What can we do to stimulate job growth?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's probably, at least listening to my constituents, probably number one question on their mind. And let's take a step back a little bit here and look at what has happened in the last couple of years. In the last couple of years, state governments, municipal governments, and of course the federal government, through sequestration, through the Budget Control Act, has actually pretty substantially reduced spending. Our deficit in this country is dropping at the fastest rate it has dropped since World War II. When I took office 5 years ago, we had a 1.6 trillion-ish deficit. Today it is probably a quarter of that. That has come, of course, at the expense of jobs. When a state cuts its budget, you're firing teachers, you're firing firefighters, municipalities getting rid of first responders. You may say that that's the right thing to do from a deficit standpoint, but it absolutely contributes to unemployment, directly because those folks don't have jobs, but also indirectly because, of course, those folks who lose jobs, guess what? They're not buying new refrigerators, new cars, not eating in restaurants, and there's an effect. The Federal Reserve, for example, in their testimony 2 weeks ago, said that the austerity that the various governments in this country has imposed has probably resulted in hundreds of thousands of jobs either going away or not being created. So the answer to the question, of course, is what could we do now to help increase the number of jobs? We're U.S. government of the state of Connecticut. The thing we could do now would be to do something that we are going to do anyway, which is to invest substantially in our infrastructure. I'm talking about our bridges, our roadways, and of course, for those of you who are from my district and know about Metro North, our railways. We are going to make the spending anyway. We're not going to tolerate bridges that fall down. We're going to spend the money. Today we can borrow that money at pretty close to 0% interest rates. And of course, when you rebuild a bridge and a highway, and Joe Biden was making fun of Kennedy Airport LaGuardia Airport the other day, that puts carpenters and metal workers and operating engineers and architects to work. So in the very near term, we should be investing a lot of money in our infrastructure. This is our economic lifeblood. And then you step back and you say, well, what else? What else will create jobs? What
about technology, like research? Connecticut is a big technology state. How about, is there any federal programs to put money into research and development?
Right, and I'm sure you saw just yesterday the governor announced a very substantial commitment by United Technologies for aerospace research in Connecticut. That's a very good thing. The governor also obviously having focused on biotech. I was just about to pick up your what is this? This is a Samsung, I guess, probably not made in this country, but I wave this around a lot when I talk about research because this is a pretty amazing device that is amazing because of the internet, right? The internet, of course, was a project of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. This has a semiconductor in it, which the research for semiconductor was done by the federal government in the 1950s. This uses GPS. GPS is a bunch of satellites that are up there because the federal government put these up. The story I'm telling here is that kind of research creates the skeleton around which Google and Microsoft and IBM and Samsung, in this case, built a very powerful and innovative private sector.
You mentioned infrastructure. Probably the second most popular question I got was regarding Metro North, service interruptions on probably what's the busiest commuter rail line in the country. It's got to be right up there. Lately, there's been tons of problems, and it doesn't seem to be improving. What are they doing for infrastructure on the rails, on things like that?
Another really good question, and one very important to my constituents. There are a bunch of problems associated with Metro North. The one I would highlight first is it is pretty clear at this point that you had a major operational and management culture issue at Metro North. This was an organization, and the reason I say was is because, of course, we've got a new president of Metro North, and we're all kind of keeping our fingers crossed and, putting a lot of weight on his shoulders to change this. But it's very clear that Metro North was operating with a culture that tolerated mistakes, and we saw mistake after mistake after mistake.
Now, I'm just not that familiar with the structure of Metro North. Is it a private company, or is it a federal run program? What's the structure?
So Metro North is essentially one of the regional railways, like the LIRR, like New Jersey Transit, Metro North, which is, the management is appointed by the various governors of the states involved. And there's a lengthy conversation to be had, probably beyond the scope of this hangout, about whether Connecticut, both gets enough say on the overall MTA board, and whether we're, for example, being compensated enough by Amtrak, which uses the tracks that the state of Connecticut owns. So Amtrak runs their trains through there between New York and Boston every single day. They pay a leasing fee to do that. Is that enough to support, and this is the other point I wanted to make, the kind of capital investment that we know we need in those rails? Those of you who ever look at who look at either the Coscob Rail Bridge across the Coscob Harbor there, or the Norwalk Rail Bridge, that's technology that was put in place shortly after the Civil War, and it's operating in the 21st century.
Riveted steel, basically.
Right.
Okay, let's see. Had a lot of responses about weapons laws. Connecticut just enacted a gun control law regarding people to mandatory register certain types of firearms. Somebody asked by email, what do you envision being done on a national level to satisfy gun owners who are on a sportsman while making the nation safer?
Yeah, I tell you, that's a tough question to answer, because you ask about the federal level, where, as those of us from Connecticut, where actually in Hartford we passed, I think, a solid gun safety package with, permitting and registration of assault weapons and all that stuff. We failed miserably, frankly, at the federal level to move the ball forward, and not just when I say move the ball forward. Something as simple as asking people to undergo a background check before they get a weapon, which, there are people out there who have histories of violence, there are people out there affiliated with terrorist organizations. You cannot persuade me that we shouldn't do background checks on people. Get your weapon, that's fine, and exercise your Second Amendment rights, but we're going to check it out to make sure you're not a guy who has a history of violence. That, of course, didn't make it through the United States Senate because of the overwhelming power, frankly, of the NRA. So this is a multi-year process. Remember the assault weapon ban back in the when was that? The Brady Act, right? That took 4 or 5 years, maybe even 6 years to get through the Congress. So
and it was pretty watered down too. Like it only applied to certain types of assault rifles. If they had a muzzle or a flash arrestor on the muzzle or something like, some very minimal things that still allowed a ton of U.S.-made AK-47-like weapons to be, exempt. And so, that got watered down back in the 1980s when, the two parties worked together a lot better. Reagan and Tip O'Neill seemed to get along a lot better than our current president and our current House Speaker. Yeah,
no, I got to tell you, Bob, it's enormously frustrating. All too often, even in in polite conversation, this argument devolves into, are you for or against the Second Amendment? I think most Americans are like I am, which is I'm all for the Second Amendment and people's right to responsibly bear arms, to own a weapon. Look, if you believe that you're safer in your house with a gun, I'll give you that. There's not a shred of data that suggests that that's true, but I'm willing to give you that. I'm just saying that, like every other right that is guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, every other right that we as Americans have, there will be some regulation on it. We're going to, we should check people out to make sure they don't have a history of violence. We should say that there are some guns whose sole purpose is military, that is to say, to kill a lot of people quickly, and there's just no conceivable self-defense or hunting use. We draw the line somewhere, right? You don't get to buy an artillery piece, right?
Things like that.
Yeah.
So what's the date that Obama is going to take our guns away? That was another,
well,
is there an actual
funny
deadline?
You should ask. I can tell you, but it's classified.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, the ACA, Obamacare. Currently, a lot of people are saying that it's pretty much of a mess. it needs to be repaired in some ways. What would you do, or what legislation would you back to kind of make it more streamlined and more have people have it more accessible to them?
So I think a mess is probably the worst characterization that the opponents of the ACA would say it is. Look, the way I think about the ACA, and I've been, for the 5 years I've been here, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. It's doing some really good things, and it has had some real stumbles. There are 13 million people in this country, and those 13 million people are comprised of new signups in private insurance on the website, kids that are between 21 and 26 who get to go on their parents' insurance now, and new Medicaid people. These are lower income people who are getting health insurance through Medicaid. 13 plus million Americans who now have health insurance who didn't necessarily have it before. As a result of the ACA, if you had diabetes or you experienced breast cancer or you had any other pre-existing conditions, 5 years ago, you were just out of luck. Today, you can get health insurance. These are good things.
That's a biggie. Definitely.
And the ACA can only take partial credit for this, but for the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen actually the inflation in the healthcare business be very, very historically low. So that's all good stuff. On the liability side of the ledger, of course, healthcare.gov, when it was rolled out, was a disaster. It didn't work. A lot of people were very frustrated, and of course, it gave people pause. Can the government actually get this done? Well, that site's working. We also went through the fact that, a lot of people who had individual plans, these were, in some cases, plans that weren't terribly good, but people seemed to like them. They discovered that those plans were not going to be reoffered by their insurance companies. That was, and by the way, the president, of course, said that wouldn't happen, so that created a lot of friction there.
Do you think the insurance companies might have used this as an opportunity to pull back coverages? In other words, say, well, we're not going to offer these plans anymore because it's become too expensive, or employers have started dropping their insurance, saying, well, Obamacare made it too expensive for us to offer insurance. And so, do you think that there should be some way that they have to answer for that kind of those actions? Is it regular business practice to do something like that? Should it be allowed?
Yeah, look, the insurance companies obviously in the old world would insure those people who probably weren't going to use the insurance and refuse to insure those people who, were going to use the insurance. And look, that's ominous and it leads to human tragedy, but these, at the end of the day, insurance companies are businesses. They're acting, in their own shareholders and self-interest. The good thing about the Affordable Care Act is that dynamic no longer exists. They have to cover people in exchange for more Americans under the individual mandate signing up. The other thing we need to remember here, Bob, is of course, the opponents of the ACA, the people who 4 years ago were explaining that this thing had death panels in it, that we're going to send grandma to an early grave. Today they're saying, well, look, premiums are going up. Well, guess what? Premiums have been going up for the last 75 years, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but come back down to the fact that for the first time in generations now, we're actually seeing low single-digit healthcare inflation. And that's huge. That's huge for Medicare. It's huge for state budget. It's if that continues, that makes a lot of very big problems smaller.
Okay, let's see. Some of these that we've gotten through the website. What measures can the House take? This is from Frederick Chu. What measures can the House take to counter Citizens United? Example, defining money as speech and corporations as persons with equal rights to living person. Citizens United, I think, is a terrible, terrible, idea, and the fact that it got through is so damaging, I think, to our idea of democracy. Where do you stand on that?
I agree with you. I think it was a terrible decision. As a result, rather than having less money in our political system, which I think pretty much everybody wants. I mean, look, I like all of my colleagues down here, spend an obscene amount of time raising money for the next race. At best, that's a waste of time. And by the way, our efforts may amount to just a drop in the bucket relative to the tidal wave of money that Citizens United freed up. This is the wealthy individuals who set up a super PAC. My friend Gary Peters in Michigan has already had $2 million of Koch brother money running ads against him.
And there's no limits. There's no limits to what they can raise. So it's basically whoever wants to bankroll the most, an individual or a corporation can do that and be protected. Whereas if I wanted to donate, I think what is it, $2,500 for the maximum. How do I counter the millions that are pouring into a campaign? That discourages the average person from sending in $50 or $25,
Right.
because it's so
Right.
it seems like such a drop in the bucket compared to the forces that have all the power.
Yeah, no, look, it's a broken system, and Citizens United made it worse. What can we do in the House? That's actually a really good question there in the Congress. That's a good question because, of course, the Supreme Court decision, which effectively equated political giving with free speech and therefore turned this into a First Amendment issue, that was a Supreme Court ruling, an interpretation of the First Amendment. So the answer is it's hard for us unless the Supreme Court reverses itself, which someday I hope they do. What we can do is we can play around the margins with regulation. We can say, okay, yes, Mr. Adelson, you can give unlimited amounts to this particular super PAC, but you have to identify yourself. You have to, these PACs have to identify their donors. We can rule out foreigners. We tried to do this, by the way, in something called the Disclose Act. You could put all sorts of regulation around it so people at least had transparency in who was giving the number, in the money. That, of course, did not pass the House. And it's, look, there's an industry built around this, right? We now, whether we're governors or senators or congressmen, run for re-election, spend an immense amount of money buying advertising. The advertising, of course, doesn't particularly edify anybody on the issues that most people care about. And you're in this vicious cycle. And of course, it puts people like me, who would love to see a reform of the system, in a sort of hypocritical position, because we've got to be out there playing the game, which has a bunch of rules that are pretty awful rules.
So because this was a Supreme Court decision, legislation couldn't fix it? Is that what you're saying? It has to be overturned by the Supreme Court? Can you? Or
a constitutional amendment, which of course is...
That's not going to happen.
Well, one step at a time.
When they repeal the Second Amendment, you love space for an amendment, so yeah, that makes sense.
You're playing into people's worst fears here, Bob.
I can't help it. I'm a blogger. What can I say? Okay, the midterms are coming up. The 2014 midterms. That looks like it's going to be a pretty interesting political season. What do you see in terms of gains? How do you think? Or do you think we'll be able to hold on to the Senate and make some gains in the House?
First of all, what are we?
Yeah,
I was going to say we're 8 or 9 months away. That's a couple of lifetimes in the political world. You look back on where we were in October and November as an example. October, November, the Ted Cruz caucus shuts down the government for 16 days and threatens to default on our debt. The Republicans got absolutely obliterated in the polls. And 2 weeks later, of course, Obamacare, the website, the healthcare.gov doesn't work, and we get obliterated. I mean, there's a room for a lot of change there. Look, today I think we being the Democrats, narrowly keep the Senate. I would tell you that that's not a sure thing, but I think that we do. I think it's going to be very challenging for us to retake the House, but not impossible. Just when you get discouraged about our ability to persuade people to vote for us, I'm talking about the generic Democrats, the leading candidate for governor in Texas and current attorney general runs around with Ted Nugent, who calls an African-American president a mongrel. And it's, Todd Aiken, telling us that women have a way in their bodies of shutting that whole thing down if they get raped. Just every week there's another thing like that I think causes people to realize that the Republican way of thinking is not one that is likely to be constructive for their kind of kitchen table issues.
I actually think those guys are just moonlighting as writers for The Daily Show, because they're giving such great ammunition for that half hour every night that it keeps the entertainment factor up.
That is true.
Okay, let's see what else we got in terms of questions. Phil Harriu, what are your feelings about the simplification of tax codes so business can prosper?
Well, the simplification of the tax code is a great idea, not just so business can prosper, but so that all of us can spend a lot less time filling out 1040 forms, and so that we don't need as many, tax accountants and tax lawyers and IRS agents. So simplification is, I think, an unadulteratedly good thing. And I'll give Dave Camp credit. I haven't gotten through the 979 pages of Chairman Camp's proposal, but he put a proposal on the table which would dramatically simplify the tax code. So the simplification part of it is terrific. And now here's the problem. The tax code is complicated because every page has 3 gifts to what we would derisively call special interests. And of course, when I use the word special interests, you're supposed to think oil companies, insurance companies. But guess where an awful lot of that those gifts go? They go to mortgage interest deductions. They go to deductions for philanthropic contributions. So we all benefit from a lot of the muck that is in the tax code. Ironically, actually, we don't all benefit. Folks that aren't taxpayers, of course, lower income people who aren't itemizing deductions, they don't benefit from these giveaways in the tax code. So simplification would be a good thing.
Okay. Edward Donovan writes, knowing the knowledge and skills of students from the United States rank somewhere in the middle compared to students from other countries, in what way can the United States implement education strategies that incorporate the use of learning tools on the internet to allow students to learn skills at which they are deficient and at a pace which works best for them?
Yeah,
very specific kind of question.
Yeah, very appropriate in this context, I guess. I think the core of learning. I mean, if you're going to take a kid in Stanford or Bridgeport or Norwalk or Greenwich and really educate that kid in a powerful way, you're going to be hard pressed to do that just using technology. And of course, what I'm saying here is that there's just no substitute for really good teachers, really committed to doing what they do. That said, my kids, I've got 2 girls. They spend much of their life at home on their various devices, and I would much rather see them doing constructive learning things than Flappy Bird or whatever it is this week that they're onto. And of course, distance learning, right? I mean, we live in a very densely populated state, but if you lived in western Nebraska until recently and you wanted to learn Chinese, my guess is you were out of luck. But now with distance learning and the internet, my guess is that we'll have an opportunity to get very technical learning into any community in our country.
It just seems like that would go against the establishment, the educational establishment, that it may affect employment of teachers and the status quo. So they'd have to find a way to incorporate it into a curriculum, using live teachers and maybe expanding on that.
Yeah, look, I think it's a long time. It's going to be a long time before we're learning from machines. I mean, the learning process is, what we're doing right now. Idea, response, discourse. Machines don't do that yet. I mean, 20 years from now, maybe they will. But there's just no substitute for having a teacher. And I actually think if Frederick Chu, who asked a question earlier, he's a music teacher. He is limited to customers who are, within a 20-mile radius of his store. The internet, I think, opens opportunities for him to address markets everywhere. But he will, at least now for a while anyway, that teacher will always be there.
Right. When we recently raised the debt ceiling, were there any cuts to spending whatsoever attached to that?
So this last raise of the debt ceiling 3 weeks ago was what we call a clean raise, and we've been listening for years now to the Republicans say we're only the original Boehner rule was right that for every $1 we raise the debt ceiling we take $1 in cuts. And there have been dramatic cuts to the federal budget, and the sequester was the most notable, which did a lot of damage. By the way, across the board, right? I mean, to Head Start programs as well as to defense contractors. But and this is actually a good thing for the country. The debt ceiling, and we could get into the debt ceiling if people are interested. It's just sort of an absurdity. It's never sort of kept the U.S. debt down, and all it does is most recently provide a context for people to threaten the financial stability of the country. The president, and I think this may be one of his accomplishments, has made it clear that neither the Republicans and presumably in the future the Democrats are going to get to use that very destructive vehicle to extort is probably the right word, a policy objective.
Recently, the filibuster was abolished in the Senate for certain types of appointments. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm sort of chuckling because it was far from abolished, right? It was very, very limited, right? The nuclear option was limited to
appointments.
You can't filibuster, not just appointments, right? Non-judicial appointments, right?
Okay.
So, but step back away from that. Look, the filibuster, I think, is a real problem, and the idea that one individual senator can effectively bring any legislation to a halt is absurd. Look, the Senate begins by being a fairly undemocratic mechanism, right? I mean, the 40 million people of California have 2 citizens and have 2 senators, and
right.
whatever it is, 300,000 people of Wyoming have 2 senators, and then the idea that you should need 60 votes to really effectively pass anything, and that's just not. Real democracy. And I'm in favor, don't get me wrong here, I'm in favor for some protections of the minority, but we really saw this most recently on background checks, right? I mean, what was it? I think there were 57, 58 senators.
Yeah, it was obviously a majority wanted to see that enacted, and
and because they didn't hit that 60-vote threshold, even though they had a majority, we don't have background checks.
I think they should go back to the filibuster rules from the 1800s. We actually had to stand on your feet and talk until you dropped.
And Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah. I mean, like they did with in Texas recently with that what was it, Wendy Davis, the filibuster for they're trying to pass a law on birth control.
That's also a nice erosion of seniority. I like to believe that those of us in our 40s, we'd be better at that than the 190-year-olds.
True. Yeah. Okay, let's see. We need salt for our icy roads. That's kind of a Connecticut government problem rather than federal government. Could you set up a national salt plant so we can just get a huge mine and just ship it all out?
I think we need a tax benefit for salt delivers.
Okay.
Hey, there's a good story there actually. The city of Bridgeport ran out of Bridgeport and Greenwich are opposite ends of my congressional district, and the city of Bridgeport ran out of salt actually, and thanks to the good work of some of my staff, but also Peter Tessie, who's first selectman in Greenwich. Greenwich sent a bunch of salt up to Bridgeport. That's the kind of
working together.
Yeah, there you go. It doesn't happen in this building, but apparently can happen in Fairfield County.
Okay, I say a lot when I'm reading. Standard deduction for businesses to retain a portion of their profits. That gets back to the tax code. That's kind of an interesting thing, for small businesses. Wouldn't it be great if there was a standard deduction to kind of give them a little leeway to, boost their profits? And what would you think of something like that? Like maybe something that works for small businesses under 500 employees or something like that?
Yeah, there's a crew of manufacturers in the Bridgeport area who have been pushing a piece of legislation that I support. It's called MRA, and basically the idea is that profits that you set aside for capital investment. Of course, you invest in capital that's growing. You're gonna grow your business. You're gonna employ more people. That it would be a little bit like it's called MRA because it would be kind of like an IRA. You could put this money away into one of these accounts, not pay taxes on the gain, and so long as you spent it on capital equipment, you would get a tax break. I think particularly for capital-intensive businesses, I think there's something to be said for having a tax advantage for them. I like the MRA idea, and we need to remember that a lot of the new businesses that we see, the ones that get all the attention, that get bought up by Facebook for $2 billion, there's gonna be 6 guys in a studio, right? Whereas if you're doing more old school manufacturing where you need to invest a lot in capital, your need for cash is very different.
Okay, NSA Oversight seems to be an issue that a lot of people are concerned with. The NSA is this huge, mysterious part of the government that can apparently spy on everything we do electronically. They're watching. And, the biggest concern is there's no transparency in terms of their oversight, and I'm fine with them wanting to prevent terrorist attacks and to prevent attacks on our nation, but what about what's going to keep them honest? What's going to keep them from hearing about Google's going to split, before anybody else hears it, and investing on their own, How do you prevent that from happening if you got the keys to the kingdom of knowing everything that everybody's doing?
Yeah. I'm a little less worried about NSA employees knowingly and sort of, with malice, doing insider trading. There's just, and for those who don't know, I sit on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, so I'm actually one of the people charged with oversight of the NSA and the intelligence community. And I can tell you that the examples of...
Do you have the password to get on their network? Because I should take a look around.
Well, if you forget any of your own passwords, I can help you out with that. So I spend a lot of time with these people, and I worry less about, honestly, the rogue person who's going to insider trade. Not that that isn't going to happen. It's, you're going to have bad apples in any organization. What I worry more about, and by the way, on that kind of stuff, that's easy to identify as a problem, and people get caught. There's a word called love-int. This is SIGINT and human love-int is every once in a while, there'll be somebody at one of the intelligence agencies who decides they're going to check out their ex-wife or whatever. But those examples are extraordinarily rare. What I worry much more about is it's kind of how you cook a frog by turning up the temperature. The more we get comfortable with surveillance, the more the next incremental step is relatively easy. And the metadata program. This is the business records. The NSA in some database knows that I called you on my cell phone. We're both Americans. To me, there's a lot of misinformation out there about that. They're not listening to your phone calls. They're not looking at what you're doing on the internet. But just the fact that the NSA has a database somewhere that they query with very, very careful legal approval, I still don't like the idea that they know that I called you. We're American citizens.
Right.
And particularly since that program has not been obviously helpful in disrupting terrorism, I think that's an example of where we just stepped a little far over the line there. But I do want to make this point. Look, I spent a lot of time around the CIA, the NSA, the intelligence community. These are almost without exception. You've got, obviously these bad apples, but these are people who are very patriotic, who work very hard to try to keep this country safe, who I think do take privacy rights and the law seriously. And so, I do think, after 9/11, right, we spent a ton of money on counterterrorism, and we passed the Patriot Act, which I think did just probably push things a little bit over the line that most Americans are comfortable with in terms of surveillance.
Yeah, I think that made it easier for people to accept, just because the most important concern is security, being secure. But at what point are you giving up so many of your personal freedoms for that security, and who makes the decisions that you don't have that freedom anymore?
Sure.
That's the quandary, I think, for the NSA and how we run intelligence in this country.
Well, this poses the other issue, which is that it's not really a quandary for the NSA, right? Those guys are charged with. It's a quandary for us, as citizens in a democracy, and the reason I highlight that is because, and this is where the whole Edward Snowden thing becomes both interesting and problematic. We should have a conversation about where those lines are drawn. I have constituents who are perfectly comfortable with the metadata program, and I've got constituents who are not. But when those programs are, some of the most closely held secrets of the government, how do we have that conversation? And by the way, there's no good answer to that. I know that the answer is not, an Edward Snowden every 5 years. That guy did enormous damage to our national security. And of course, we shouldn't have a system that relies on, disgruntled 27-year-olds to get that conversation catalyzed. But in a democracy, we have got. And I guess what it does, it comes down to the overseers, people like me, who have to stay alert and have to stay skeptical, and remember that even if a program looks okay today, what could that program be used for by an administration that had a lot less respect for civil liberties?
Okay. We just got some new questions here. All right. Gary Banks asks, I know you're on the House Committee on Financial Services. I was really upset by by Senator Levin's hearing with Credit Suisse, I think it's called, close.
Credit Suisse?
Yeah, yesterday. What can we do to crack down on tax fraud, which is a pretty, significant issue? People hiding money overseas and, evading their lawful, payment to the government.
Yeah, I didn't see the hearing that is being referred to there, so I'm not sure what was said or what was done in that hearing. We do.
You get like cliff notes when you miss a hearing. You not miss a hearing, but you're not at a hearing. Do you get like cliff notes or something?
Don't get cliff notes.
Yeah, no, really? That would be awesome. I'd read something like that. Every hearing they just had like 2 pages of high points.
So I need another 700 pages of reading to do everything. That'd be terrific. Yeah, good idea, Bob. But anyway, I didn't see the hearing, but obviously you have a real issue where people will sometimes park money abroad. They'll make money on that money, and they won't report it to the IRS. And there's actually been, you mentioned Credit Suisse, that was pretty rampant with some of the Swiss banks because the Swiss have very aggressive banking privacy laws. So, what do? You work in concert with Europe and countries that where people might try to hide their money to make sure that it's not being done for that purpose. And that's always a kind of give and take, because of course the Swiss market themselves is having very good privacy. Which, by the way, raises another really important thing, because we're still coming out of the mess that occurred in 2008, which centered in these international money center banks. Not only do we need to sort of work on making sure we know what's going on tax-wise, we need to make sure that we've got pretty consistent and solid and thoughtful regulation across jurisdictions.
How do you feel about like Glass-Steagall? Do you think we should return to the separation of investment banks from commercial banks? Do you think we should put more safeguards in place to keep this runaway, speculation going on that helped precipitate the crisis?
Yeah. So sitting here today, when we're 50-60% through the rule writing of the new regulations that were put forward by Dodd-Frank, including some regulations which gave the government enormous power to restructure large banks. I'm not sure that I would say today what we need to do is reinstitute Glass-Steagall and break up Citibank and break up J.P. Morgan Chase. By the way, it may come to that. We were in the process of seeing how Dodd-Frank rolls out, whether it works, whether it ended too big to fail. Those are, everybody has strong opinions about it. Those are very much open questions. The reason I'm a little skeptical about it is twofold. One, and by the way, it may turn out to be the right reason, but the reason I'm skeptical about it today is, number one, we're rolling out Dodd-Frank. We're putting new and much more stringent capital requirements on these entities. And number two, if you think back on the crisis, the first three catastrophes, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and AIG, were two brokerages and an insurance company. Neither one of those were under Glass-Steagall jurisdiction. Glass-Steagall was a law that said that regular banks couldn't have investment banks attached. None of those catastrophes, which really catalyzed the mess, would have in any way been affected by Glass-Steagall. And of course, what was at the very core of the meltdown, which was the existence of absolutely toxic mortgages, liar's loans. They then got, of course, bundled up into terrible bonds that got traded and derivatives written. Again, those mortgages were not in any way prohibited by Glass-Steagall. So my point is simply that sitting here today, I'm not sure that that's the answer. I think we need to let the regulations for Dodd-Frank be rolled out. We need to be vigilant about what these, what we call them now, systemically important financial institutions do, and then sort of sit back after Dodd-Frank has been, has permeated the system and see if we got it right.
Kevin Sutherland asks, Election Day currently falls on a work day and is not recognized as a national holiday. Would you be willing to support a bill to change this and allow more people time off to go and vote?
I would support anything which makes it easier for Americans to vote, and that's a big deal these days.
Connecticut just went to, I think, same-day registration.
Yep.
Denise Merrill helped get that through.
Yep.
So happy to see that.
And I sort of want to say that again because it's so important today. I will support anything that makes it easier for Americans to vote because, of course, we're engaged in this country in pushing back against efforts, often in Republican-dominated red states in the South, that are designed to make it harder for Americans to vote, in particular for African Americans, for young people, for older minority populations to vote. And they say this is all about preventing fraud, without, of course, being able to offer up one or any more than a handful of examples of fraud, while potentially disenfranchising tens of thousands of people who, lo and behold, tend to vote Democratic. So early voting, same-day registration, better protection at the polls. I think anything. Look, I mean, what's more fundamental to our country than the right to vote? So I know it's traditional to go on a Tuesday, but if Sunday makes it easier for people to vote, I bet you I could back that.
Or a two-day national election, something like that, maybe. I mean, it's difficult because even with holidays, probably 20 to 30% of the workforce is working anyway. I mean, we don't have a traditional 5-day work week anymore where people have weekends off. So even if we had Sunday voting, I know I work Sundays, you know, and it's a lot of people go to any mall on a Sunday. You know, people are there all day, you know, so it's a tough question. How are we doing on time? I don't want to. I want to be able to, you know,
about another 15 minutes or so.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. Somebody asked a specific question, Tyler Champlin, about HR 792, which I know you don't know the numbers offhand. It's like you have to know the name of it. The Traditional Cigar Manufacturing and Small Business Jobs Preservation Act of 2013. This sounds like something that's like helping industries that are in cigar manufacturing to, you know, some sort of helping them do their jobs. You know, I don't know. Have you heard of it? Do you know about it? How many bills are on the floor at any particular time in Congress? That's a good question.
Well, on the floor, how many bills have been submitted?
How many
you know, they've got, what have we got in this Congress? We've got, you know, some 5,000 or something. Of course, you know 4,007. Well, you know, 90% of them never even see the light of day in committee, and of course, a very small percentage of the remainder ever make it to the floor. Particularly in the House, where the only thing that's going to make it to the floor is whatever the majority wants to bring to the floor. You know, there is a terrific.
We don't have the filibuster in the House where we can actually put it to good use. Can we change that, please?
Because we are a majority-rule democratic institution. I mean that with a small d, by the way, in contrast to the Senate, which you know is a questionable democratic bona fides. But
40 people is the majority in the Senate. Still kills me.
You know, there's a terrific. My wife would kill me for saying this because she hates it when I do it. But there's a terrific cigar shop in Norwalk. And I do probably smoke a cigar or two a year.
You're talking about?
Yeah.
The cigar is a cigar warehouse. We're not putting in a plug. Sorry, I don't want to. No, I've been there. It's great.
Yeah. Anyway, I've talked to those guys, and I don't know if this is the same issue, but they effectively said, look, you know, we're specialty cigars, very different thing than a pack of cigarettes, and we want to be regulated slightly differently. I dived into it a little bit, and the way I think about that is if this is about the nature of the business model, you know, I'm kind of open to recognizing that, you know, there's a big difference between a guy who's making specialty cigars in Connecticut and, you know, Marlboro. But with respect to health, you know, tobacco is, and again, I will indulge once in a blue moon, but tobacco is obviously not.
That's the way it's intended. You know, it's not meant to be a habit. So I'm fine with that. Let's talk about some of the things you're co-sponsoring. You know, like what have you introduced? What are you co-sponsored? What's currently on the plate in the House that you're working on?
I guess I'd highlight a couple of areas, maybe three areas. Number one, I have long made a push on early childhood education, and this kind of comes back to you asked about you know, online learning. You know, one of the real challenges that we face in communities that have troubled educational systems is, you know, we focus on the schools and we focus less on the fact that particularly kids who, you know, grow up in poverty, kids who grow up in single-parent households where that single parent is working 3 jobs, you know, often arrive at kindergarten already way behind that, you know, middle-class, affluent, highly educated families' children. The single biggest predictor of the success of a child in school is the educational level of their parents, right? And I think about that. That's not right, right?
It gets passed down. Definitely.
Yeah, and so I have, you know, done a number of bills that would try to look at programs. There's some in Bridgeport, for example, a program called Total Learning that are showing good results and you know, encourage states and municipalities to invest in that early childhood education. That's one category, and I think you know, that's really important. You know, we talk so much about jobs, and of course I go to infrastructure as I did, which is really important, but you know, jobs 20, 30 years from now have everything to do with how we're educating our 4- and 5-year-olds today. Another area that I'm excited about, but it's pretty technical and pretty esoteric. I did a lot of affordable housing before I got into this job, and I'm working with Congressman Delaney and Congressman Carney to propose version 2.0 of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, people's eyes are already glazing when I say those things, but they are key components of our housing engine. They're basically what make the 30-year fixed mortgage available to American families, and that's one of the ways, in many cases, one of the only ways American families accumulate assets and wealth and save. And so I'm working on a bill that would kind of come up with version 2.0, which we hope would be safer and smarter than the original versions, which crashed and burned in 2008. And then I am, sitting as I do on the Intelligence Committee, offering up some ideas, some legislation that I think would provide for better oversight of our intelligence community. So those are kind of three areas where I've been active in the last year or so.
Hey, that buzzer, I don't know if they were able to hear that over the computer. Is that like telling you there's a vote going on? Or?
You see it right there. 11 minutes and 45 seconds till I need to be voting.
They let you know in case you're dozing or something. They let you know. That's great. That's great.
Bob, with 9% approval rating, we don't need to publicize the possibility that we'd be dozing on business hours.
You don't need that. Okay, let's see. David Hartman, I'm an employee at Save the Children here in Westport, Connecticut, and I'm wondering what initiatives or legislation that you're supporting to help kids in Connecticut and the USA and around the world. I think you pretty much covered that in just recently, right? Is there anything you could add to that?
Gosh, kids in the U.S., again, I would come back to, and I don't want to be repetitive, to early childhood education. A big one for families in Fairfield County and I think around the country is making childcare more accessible for working moms. One of the reasons the middle class has been able to hang on by their fingernails, and it has been hanging on by their fingernails, is because in contrast to when you and I were toddlers, most women work now.
Right.
And yet we don't have the infrastructure for those mothers to cost effectively have their kids looked after in a good way. So there's a lot to talk about. I mean, my God, globally, malnutrition. One of the things that we're very proud of. I think we should all be very proud of is that PEPFAR, which was a George W. Bush program, credit where credit is due, has offered the possibility that we would eliminate, I know Save the Children cares about this, that we would eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission in places like Africa where babies are used to be born HIV positive because of their mothers. PEPFAR and research has really made it possible that will no longer happen. But globally the problems are still very severe. We had maybe do the last one here. Otherwise, I'll miss votes. And Congressman Himes says he's attentive to his job, but here on video he's missing votes. Talking to Connecticut Bob.
Do you support? Greg French asked this. Do you support the Student Loan Forgiveness Act of 2012? Student Loan Forgiveness Act of 2012, proposed by Hanson Clark, Democrat of Michigan. Have you heard about that? Now, apparently 2012, so it didn't probably go over.
No, I remember Hanson. He's not here anymore in this Congress, but I don't remember that particular bill. There's a lot of interesting ideas out there, so I can't address that bill specifically, but there's some great ideas out there. Number one, we have to push universities, and how do we do that? Well, an awful lot of federal money goes for research at our universities and colleges. We need to really push universities to get their cost growth out of control. A lot of these institutions are private, so we don't necessarily have jurisdiction. We can't force them to, but we can say, hey, 10% a year tuition hikes is eventually going to make it that nobody can get a college education at a time when everybody, well, not everybody, but if you're going to be middle class, you're going to have some post-secondary education. Elizabeth Warren has an interesting idea, which is why should student loans be any more expensive than the federal funds rate, which is the rate, of course, that banks lend to each other. Obviously, the point being, can we keep the interest rate on student loans lower? There's a lot we need to do there. And by the way, we've made real progress. It used to be, until 4 years ago, that, and I'm very proud of the Congress that moved my first Congress where this was accomplished. It used to be that banks made a ton of money without taking really any risk at all on student loans. The government took the risk, the bank made the money. Today now, the government's still taking the risk, but it's not the banks, it's the government who is making the money, and therefore, has the possibility of recycling that back into making education more available to all.
Sounds like a step in the right direction, at least. But in terms of loan forgiveness, there's nothing going on currently.
There are programs, for example, the ACA, Obamacare included programs that would provide loan forgiveness for nurses and other medical professionals who agree to serve in underutilized areas. A lot of doctors get trained through our military, through sort of ROTC-like programs. But it is interesting to ask yourself the question, could we expand that so that kids don't feel the pressure? I meet kids every day who are graduating with $100,000 in debt. that's not a comfortable thing to begin with, but it also means that it's going to be pretty hard for that individual to pursue if their dream is to be a literature professor, maybe off the table. Yeah. So I do think there's room to be innovative on tying the payback of a student loan to your ultimate income. I think that'd be we should pursue that idea, I think.
Okay, well, I think we're you got to get off and vote. So thanks very much for having me here to ask these questions.
It was a lot of fun. Hopefully, it was enjoyable to the folks out there, and we'll do more of this. Pretty easy to set up, and hopefully give us comments on Twitter or Facebook, and we'll do more of this. Pretty easy to set up. Thanks, Bob.
So long.
Take care.